As I mentioned a few minutes ago, freelancer is essentially the absence of a job, and as such, it can use every single weapon type, but doesn't feature any stat modifiers, and as such, is generally weaker than every other specialized job. However, that statement doesn't necessarily hold true for the entirety of the game. You see, whenever you reach a job's final level, it is considered to be mastered. And when a character masters a job, they inherit its positive traits as a freelancer. This means, depending on how much grinding you're willing to do, freelancer has the capability of becoming the best job available, since it can theoretically combine the positive attributes of every single job. For example, if we look at the Knight job, it has a positive modifier on strength of 23, agility of 1, and stamina of 20. So if you reach level 6 as a knight, then your freelancer will also get the modifier of strength plus 23, agility plus 1, and stamina plus 20. However, it does not inherit the minus 14 magic stat, and instead keeps the freelancer's modifier of 0. And that's because the freelancer will default to the highest available modifier it has. So if you master both Knight and Thief, instead of taking the plus 1 modifier from Knight, freelancer will take the plus 16 modifier from Thief. Pretty cool stuff, and as a result, freelancer becomes a bit of a stat ball. But believe it or not, things actually get better from there, because freelancers also inherit the passive skills of any job they mastered. So once again, looking at the Thief, in addition to gaining that 16 agility, freelancer would have the find passages skill, the sprint skill, and the vigilance skill. However, it would not gain the ability to steal, since that is an activated command, and the freelancer doesn't get those for free. Although, it can equip them in its ability slots, because unlike every other job in the game, the freelancer actually has 2 ability slots. And since it's capable of getting the majority of passive skills for free, those ability slots are often best utilized equipping activated abilities, in order to give your freelancer even more flexibility. And this is all well and good, but it's worth remembering that getting the fullest potential out of freelancer is going to take a lot of grinding. Ability points come very slowly in this game, with most non-boss fights giving between 1 to 3. And I found that even without going for freelancer builds, I needed to do some amount of grinding just to unlock the synergies I had in mind. Most jobs take somewhere between 500 and 700 ability points to master, and the few that take less than that, like Berserker and Bard, give much smaller benefits than these standard expensive jobs. As such, if you want to get the most out of freelancer, you're going to have to buckle down and grind. And I know that there are some RPG fans that love a good grind, but for me, it doesn't really feel like the sort of thing I want to be doing. So instead of actively building towards an endgame freelancer, I prefer combining the job synergies with each other, which, while technically weaker than a freelancer build, is still potent enough to get you through FF5's main campaign. Besides, being in the non-freelancer jobs means you get cooler outfits as opposed to the default garb of a freelancer, so that's also a really nice benefit. It is worth noting that since freelancer always takes the highest stat available, there are some ways you can optimize, especially if you're going for a physical freelancer, because Monk and Thief have the highest combined strength, agility, and stamina, meaning the only stat you would disregard is magic. And since both of those are wind crystal jobs, it's entirely viable to grab them and stick in throughout the majority of the campaign in order to get freelancers' stats online as soon as possible. So if you're dead set on a freelancer build, that would be my personal recommendation. As for mine, we'll talk about that when we get to it, which is much later in the campaign. Just bear in mind going forward that if I mention something about the job system, there is a distinct possibility that that specific trait does not apply to freelancer and mime. But with that disclaimer out of the way, I want to take a closer look at each of the Wind Crystal jobs. The Knight is a pretty straightforward job. It's a sword and board warrior, so it can equip all sorts of armor, whether heavy or light, as well as swords, shields, and knives. They also get access to a subclass of weapons known as Knight Swords, which only they and freelancers can equip. These are all powerful late-game swords, each of which has some sort of special effect associated with it. The Flame Tongue and Ice Brand deal fire and ice damage respectively. Meanwhile, the Blood Sword has the Life Drain effect, so it sucks up any damage you deal in order to heal you. Unfortunately, it deals magical damage, which is not the Knight's strong suit, but it does at the very least give you a +5 magic modifier, which would mean the Knight's total modifier is -9. Not great, but not terrible, especially with such a powerful blade. The Defender gives you an additional 25% chance to block or evade single target attacks at you, and it can cast the Protect spell if you use it as an item when it's equipped. Both Excalibur and the Brave Blade boost the wielder's strength by 5, and the Apocalypse Sword boosts your strength by 3 and your stamina by 3. The only Knight Sword that doesn't have an innate special property is Ragnarok. It is just a damn strong sword, and that's pretty good on its own. Most of these Knight Swords come quite late into the game, and so they can be a pretty good reason to take the Knight job off of the bench, especially if you haven't done a high investment freelancer build. But even if you're not planning on using them late game for Knight Swords, the Knight job has a very useful niche in the early chapters of Final Fantasy V. Since most of your stats don't go up when leveling, the primary way of increasing your bulk is through purchasing better equipment, and the Knight can wield both shields and heavy armor, including gauntlets and helmets. This means if you're willing to spend the money on their gear, the Knight will serve as your primary tank for the early game. Although, as you can expect from an Armor Knight, they will be quite slow and therefore don't get that many turns. You see, equipment in Final Fantasy V has a weight stat, and depending on how heavy your equip load is, you will lose some amount of speed. In older versions of the game, this translates to 1 speed for every 8 weight. However, in the Pixel remaster, the formula was changed, and now every 4 points of weight means you lose 1 point of speed. Don't get me wrong, it's not like the Knight doesn't get any actions, but they are certainly going to be noticeably slower as compared to the other 5 Wind Crystal jobs that use far less equipment than the Knight does. As such, it's probably wise not to have everyone on your team in heavy armor, but at least one Knight makes things a lot easier, in part thanks to their inherent abilities of cover and guard. Cover is a passive skill that means anytime an ally is at critical HP, the Knight will block single target attacks and take the damage for them. So if you have a squishy fella like a white mage or black mage, the Knight can make sure they stay alive and therefore are able to contribute with their magic spells. And the guard command helps to further supplement them in this role, as it will completely absorb the next physical attack they are hit by. So if you just have a Knight wearing the heaviest armor you can find spamming the guard command, they can potentially protect their allies and shrug off all damage on their own. These are also the first 2 abilities that the Knight learns through level up, although I don't think either of them are particularly good when taken to another job, since most of the other jobs are frail enough that you don't want them taking extra damage, or at the very least have some sort of other role in mind that is more proactive and doesn't involve tanking. But all of the Knight's other learned abilities are actually quite useful when taken into other classes. And first and foremost of these is the two-handed support skill, as this allows you to deal double damage with your weapon if you don't have anything in the offhand. For any jobs that don't have the ability to equip shields, this is a no-brainer. But it's also worth noting that some jobs who can equip shields might want to forego them in favor of the extra damage output. Berserker in particular really appreciates two-handed, since its entire purpose is dealing damage with physical attacks. And two-handed comes online relatively early. It costs a grand total of 90 ability points, 10 for cover, 30 for guard, and 50 for two-handed. And this is easily achievable by the end of the early game, so long as you're willing to leave a character in Knight, which is generally a good idea anyway. It is worth noting that two-handed does have a limitation in which weapons can benefit from it. You can only two-hand swords, katanas, axes, knight swords, and hammers. But these weapons tend to be the ones used by the most physically offensive jobs anyway, so the limitation isn't really a big deal, at least in my opinion. However, if you'd rather focus on the tanking skills, the Knight's other abilities are useful in that regard. Equip shields and equip armor, while expensive in terms of ability points, are the premier way of taking a frailer class and turning it into a bulky one. Remember, the characters don't actually have a defense stat depending on their job. The only thing that changes your bulk is your HP and your equipment. So if you want your mages to be able to take hits, getting them to equip shields and perhaps even armor is a great way of improving their survivability. That being said, this feels like a bit of a gimmick to me. Mages have their own set of equipment that they like running that will help to boost their magical prowess. So trading that out for a full set of mithril armor, while it makes them bulkier, isn't necessarily going to make them better at their primary job. And remember, with the weight system, even a utility mage is going to get slowed down by heavy armor. As such, this feels much more like a cool in theory, bad in practice application. Instead, the best way of improving a mage's bulk is to set them in the back row, because characters in the back row deal half damage with physical attacks, but they also take half damage from physical attacks. And since mages are typically slinging spells instead of doing any bonking with their staves, hanging out in the back row is usually a net positive. It's worth noting that the Knight might also want to go in the back row if they're just doing cover duty, but personally I like them in the front so that they can slash at something with a sword. Although, speaking of swords, for mastering the Knight job, you gain access to equip sword. And with this ability, you can take swords into other jobs. Which is nice, because swords are, in my opinion, one of the better weapon types, since they have a good balance of accuracy and strength. It's worth noting that this only applies to regular swords. The Knight swords are still limited to just Freelancer and Knight, alongside Gladiator in the GBA version. There's a decent number of physical jobs that can already use swords, but the ones that can't do appreciate sword access. Although arguably not enough to devote their entire ability slot to it, with the exception of Berserker, which kind of doesn't have anything better to do with its ability slot. And the fact that I've mentioned Berserker twice now for the Knight's abilities might be indicative of a bit of a problem. Outside of two-handed, no high-tier class really wants access to what the Knight has to offer. And as such, rather than being a job you focus on to try to get its super valuable skills, Knight is kind of just a job that you throw someone in when it's convenient for your upcoming dungeon or boss battle. Still, I think it's a solid job that you basically always want, at least until you reach the water crystal. And it's good enough that you can make it a mainstay past that point if you like it. It's hard to find a better tank, after all. On the opposite end of the spectrum, we have the Monk, who is primarily a damage dealer. Although, thanks to its high stamina modifier, Monk can also be much tankier than you would expect from a class without access to heavy armor. And by skipping out on that armor, Monk doesn't have to deal with the weight downside. So their agility modifier of +1 is a little deceptive since they tend to be a lot faster, in part because they're not going to be weighed down by weapons or armor. Although this does naturally lead to a question. If the only gear Monk has are combat hats and light armor, how can they even be a damage-dealing class? Don't you need good weapons for that? And the answer lies in their innate ability, barehanded. This turns their unequipped fists into a weapon with a power equal to double their level +3. And when combined with Monk's really high strength modifier of 26, and the fact that fists hit twice instead of once, alongside the 8% critical hit chance, Monk is very freaking good at deleting single targets. And much like Knight, Monk has an argument to retain this role going later into the campaign. Because while you get plenty of other damage-dealing classes at the later crystals, the fact Monk doesn't need much equipment can help your economy a lot if you're not grinding. Or let you spend the cash you got from grinding on other powerful things like throwable scrolls or strong weapons for the rest of your team. And if you stick with the Monk long term, you get rewarded with an accessory that is tailor-made for them, as the Kaiser Knuckles boost your unarmed attack by 50 if you have the barehanded skill, which is not only innate to Monk, but also learned through their tree. However, barehanded isn't Monk's only innate property. They also have the counter skill, which gives them a 50% chance to counter anyone who lands a single target attack on them. And so, when combined with the natural 8% crit chance that fists have, Monk is the job that most consistently performs above their weight class if you get lucky. Sure, sometimes they'll fail to counter, and critting is a rare occurrence, but it's the sort of thing that can pull you out from a desperate situation. And it's not like Monk's baseline is bad. They're outputting a lot of damage to single targets, and they even have a way to sweep enemies with the kick skill. Kick deals damage to everyone on the field as if they had been hit by one of the two Monk fists. So it's less effective than a single target where you would get the 1-2 punch, but it's nice against large groups of targets. Weirdly, kick is never actually learned while leveling up, so you can only use it as a Monk. Although, this does make a little bit of sense, since it doesn't factor in weapons, and as such, for most classes, it wouldn't be useful since they lack the innate barehanded ability. For Monks, however, I think it's a valuable addition to their toolkit, allowing them to perform as a sort of physical mage, since they can either focus on a single target or spread the damage out. Now, as for the abilities that Monk actually learns, the first of them is Focus, costing only 15 ability points. And this is useful both for the Monk and for other strong physical classes, as it allows you to charge up for extra time in order to launch a double-powered attack. Although this will often translate to more than double damage, since it is doubled before factoring in the enemy's defense. At level 2, you get Barehanded, which, if you equip it on another class, will not only give them the Monk's damage formulas for unarmed attacks, but also the strength modifier of 26 when unarmed. This seems really good, but for the most part, it's not actually that useful on other physical jobs. Most of them can benefit from two-handed, which is a better damage boost than barehanded. However, the few that use weapon types that aren't going to benefit from two-handed still don't really want barehanded, since the minor damage buff isn't really worth an entire ability slot. The main purpose I can see for barehanded is equipping it to a character that doesn't naturally have access to good weapons or a good strength modifier, such as the Black Mage or White Mage. White Mage especially appreciates it because she can't even use daggers. And since barehanded naturally raises your strength modifier to 26, you can create a character that is able to do both physical offense and supportive healing. And this is a much better way of making a pseudo-paladin than what the game suggests, as the job tutorial tells you about giving white magic to a knight, but I've found that isn't super helpful. The Knight has a pretty abysmal magic modifier, so the amount you're healing is not great, and utility spells like Blink and Protect are best used targeting the Knight, not by the Knight. But that's a bit of a tangent. Let's get back to talking about the Monk. Its level 3 skill, Chakra, is pretty underwhelming. It allows you to take some time off in order to heal HP, but the amount of HP healed is pretty paltry, and most teams want a dedicated healer job anyway, so making the Monk take time off from damage in order to self-sustain feels like a waste. Not only does this cost your ability slot, but anytime you use it, you're not dealing damage, which is usually what you want combat jobs to do. The only possible use case I can think of for Chakra is putting it on a knight who is tanking a bunch, and having them devote their turns to either guard or Chakra. But I think most of the time you would prefer guard, and again, if you need healing on your knight, just have a white mage do it, or a chemist, or a blue mage with white wind. If you're desperate, a high potion will also heal much more than Chakra would. It just doesn't seem all that good to me. Although thankfully, Monk's level 4 skill, Counter, is at least useful. You still have only a 50% chance to counterattack, but throwing this on your primary damage dealer isn't the worst thing in the world you can do. I've personally run it on ninjas and samurais before, but I think Knight probably benefits the most, since with its cover ability, it's going to be protecting a bunch of low HP people, and therefore will take more single target attacks than the rest of your party. So if you set things up properly, you can potentially have the Knight constantly guarding your allies and counterattacking every other foe. And weirdly, the Monk's last set of skills, HP plus 10, 20, and 30%, also all benefit the tanking strategy of the Knight. It's almost as if they gave you these two jobs at the beginning of the game in order to highlight the ways in which they can be synergistic with each other. Although, truth be told, most characters appreciate an HP boost. The only question is whether it's worth the ability slot or not, and for a lot of times it's not, but on a primary tank, absolutely worthwhile. Overall, I quite like the Monk, especially in the short term, although I'm not blown away by it in the long term. I still think it has quite a few useful attributes, in particular kick and the fact you save money on equipment, and since it has the highest strength and stamina modifiers in the game, mastering it is essential if you want to go the super freelancer route. But if you're not going for the freelancer build, I think it's a little bit underwhelming at the higher levels. Even Counter, which is probably its premier skill, is a chance-based ability, and oftentimes gets outclassed by something more guaranteed. And as the only physical class that can't benefit from dual-wield or two-handed, Monk feels like it hits its ceiling early and tapers off in the endgame. Which, if you think about it that way, kind of makes Monk into the Jagan of Final Fantasy V. The third of our physical jobs is Thief, and this is definitely the most underwhelming of them. In fact, I would argue it's the weakest of the Wind Crystal jobs, and generally one of the more one-dimensional jobs in Final Fantasy V. Looking at Thief's modifiers, you can see that its whole deal is agility. It has a plus 16 agility mod, but only plus 1 to strength, plus 2 to stamina, and a minus 6 to magic. Their equipment list is similarly unimpressive, with only knife, boomerang, combat hat, and light armor access. So, if you try to use them as a pure combat unit, Thief runs into a problem of getting a lot of turns but not doing much with any of them. Instead, Thief is pretty clearly built to be a utility unit. And this is most clearly demonstrated by their innate skills. Passages allows you to see secret passages on the map. So, the Thief is useful when you're dungeon crawling if you don't want to miss any secrets. Vigilance, on the other hand, prevents monsters from back attacking you. For the uninitiated, back attacks are a type of random encounter where the enemy gets a turn before you do, and you are out of formation. So your back row characters will be in the front row fully exposed, and your front row characters will be in the back row, meaning they deal less damage. It is pretty devastating even when your party is healthy. and if you have anyone at low HP, a back attack basically guarantees their death with nothing you can do about it. So having Vigilance either equipped on another job or innately as a thief can be useful in case of emergencies or just to make dungeon crawling easier. And the last passive that makes dungeon crawling easier is Sprint, which is a really weird choice to have tied to a specific job. In case you've never played video games before, Sprint is when you hold down a button to make your character move faster. And on the SNES, you are incapable of running without having a thief in the party or another character wasting their ability slot on Sprint. From a modern perspective, this is pretty quaint. Sprinting is typically considered to be a quality of life feature, and as such, all of the remakes, at least the ones that I played, actually add the sprint function as an innate thing that you can just do whenever you want. However, those games retain the sprint skill on Thief, and the way that it works in the Game Boy Advance and Pixel Remaster is if you have sprint equipped or a thief in your party, your run function now has doubled speed, so you can zoom all throughout the world as fast as your heart's content. I think this is a good compromise between touching up the remakes to meet modern standards, while also not losing the quirky spirit of the original. There's something really interesting about locking a quality of life feature behind a specific job, and I don't even think it's necessarily bad game design. Instead, it's more indicative of the strange position Thief finds itself in. I mean, heck, I sort of glanced over it earlier, but the passages skill just shows you information that you could look up on a guide. And as such, it feels similar to paying for hints, which is something you can do in other SNES games, such as Earthbound. But none of these quaint bits of utility are the selling point for the Thief job. Instead, that is its fourth innate skill, the Steal ability, which allows you to, well, steal items from enemies. And there are actually quite a few unique pieces of gear you can only acquire through stealing. Although this comes at a bit of a trade-off, since usually this means bringing a thief to a boss fight, which is pretty suboptimal team composition. Additionally, stealing is not guaranteed. By default, it only has a 40% chance of success, in fact. However, you can equip the Thief's Gloves accessory in order to bolster that chance to 80%, which makes it much easier to steal rare items from bosses. Now, in theory, if you didn't want to bring a thief on your team, you could just equip the Steal skill to another job, but only Thief, Freelancer, and Mime can equip the Thief's Gloves, so if you want a decent chance of stealing, chances are Thief is your go-to. And for what it's worth, while the boss weapons are the premier stealables, in this game, I think stealing from random enemies is also pretty worthwhile. Usually you only get a healing item like a potion, high potion, ether, or sometimes even elixir. But this game's economy is pretty tight, as I keep saying, and so Thief topping up your potion supply is a nice way to make sure that you have plenty for every dungeon crawl without spending so much money you can't afford new weapons and armor. The most successful farm I could find was against the zoo enemy right outside of Karnak, where you can get elixir very early in the campaign. But there's plenty of other notable steals, and one of the things I want to do with this video is highlight them as they come up in the campaign. As far as Thief's learned abilities go, we've already talked about over half of them, as Thief has a lot of skills innately. However, Scram is worth highlighting as this is a guaranteed flee, allowing you to escape from encounters when you are weak or just don't feel like fighting them. And again, we run into the theme where Thief's skills feel somewhat close to quality of life stuff. In fact, the Pixel Remaster allows you to turn off encounters altogether, rendering Scram almost useless. The only edge case where Scram could come up is if you encounter something unexpected and need to run away ASAP. Mug, on the other hand, is quite useful, as it is a standard attack with a steal chance attached to it, so it's functionally just better than steal in most situations. Although it's worth noting if you're trying to farm an item from a boss or something similar, you might not want Mug since you don't want to deal damage during your steal attempts and risk potentially killing them. Lastly, Artful Dodger is a very weird ability, and arguably is innate to the Thief, because it gives another job the Thief's ability score of 16. On the surface, this seems like it would be super useful, as speed is probably the most important stat since it determines how many actions you can take. So maxing out your agility modifier with Artful Dodger would mean your damage dealers can attack more often, or your utility units can use their skills more often. However, in practice, I find that Artful Dodger isn't worth it, both because you have to master Thief, which means keeping a character in a suboptimal job for a long amount of time, and you need to equip it in your only ability slot, which means the opportunity cost is huge. A utility unit appreciates getting more utility actions, but they also appreciate a second job command to do different forms of utility. And damage dealers would much rather have other skills that supplement their damage than boost their agility modifier to 16. The only jobs that get multiple ability slots are Mime and Freelancer, and each of these already gets the 16 agility modifier when you master Thief, so it becomes fully redundant for them. I also think if you just want 16 agility on a utility job like Bard or Time Mage, you can master those jobs instead of Thief, and then equip Time Magic or Singing on the Thief job. Not only does this take less time than mastering Thief, but you'll also be in the good utility job for longer. You know, when you're mastering Time Mage, you still get to use Time Magic. Whereas if you're mastering Thief, all you gain access to is the steals. And the steals are much more niche. I don't think they're useless, they do help bolster your economy, but they're a lot less flashy than the other utility roles. And it often feels like you're giving yourself a handicap in combat in order to advance in meta progression. And this can be an interesting choice, but I personally come off thinking less of Thief than the other Wind Crystal jobs as a result of it. The next set of jobs are all mages, so before we discuss them individually, I do need to talk about how magic works in Final Fantasy V, as it's a little bit different from the other abilities. Each school of magic has multiple levels. For example, black and white magic each have 6 levels of spells. And while white mages can cast all 6 levels of white magic inherently, in order for other classes to cast them, you must get the levels of magic one at a time. Once you acquire a specific magic level, you will be able to equip it and all lower levels. So, for example, if you get to white magic level 2, then equipping white magic on your knight will allow them to cast white magic spells of level 1 and 2. Or at least it will, so long as you've acquired the spells. Because in addition to having the appropriate level of magic, you need to acquire each spell individually. For most spells, they can be purchased at various magic shops, similar to the NES Final Fantasy games. But there are also some that are found throughout the overworld or even acquired by doing side quests, especially as it comes to the spell list for bards and summoners. Blue mages also have a special way of acquiring their spells, which I will talk about when we get to them. It is worth noting that, unlike in earlier Final Fantasy titles, acquiring a spell gives it to the entire party, so you don't need to purchase fire 4 times if you want everyone to be able to cast the spell. Because of this system, mage jobs do not benefit from grinding as much as other ones would, since you need to reach certain points in the campaign to get access to all of their tools anyway. This is generally balanced out by the fact that magic is incredibly busted in Final Fantasy V. As not only does it hit on an enemy's weaker defensive stat, but it has a lot more flexibility than basically any other ability in the game. The only downside it runs into is spells cost MP to cast, meaning there is a hard limit to how many times you can cast them in between rests. Although this can be worked around if you're willing to purchase or steal ethers and elixirs, which are far more common in this entry than the previous 4. Although ethers and elixirs are incredibly expensive, so if you use a ton of them, it eats into the incredibly tight economy. And as such, I usually preferred using tents and inns to restore my mana, and just being conservative during dungeon crawls. But that's enough preamble. I think we established enough to talk about the mages, so let's dive in with White Mage. White Mage is a support class primarily focused on healing and buffing allies, and as such, their equipment is incredibly limited. They can't equip any armor, and their only weapons are staves, which are amongst the weakest in the game. Although, staves do help White Mages fulfill their utility role, as the healing staff is a fairly early pickup that heals the target instead of damaging it. So, in order to save on MP, the White Mage can target allies with the healing staff in order to restore their HP without needing to cast any spells. This is especially helpful in the early game when your mana pool is more limited. Although it's worth noting, the healing staff is not a full replacement for the cure spells, as you are unable to group cast with the healing staff, so you must use your spell pool for that function. Aside from that, White Mage is remarkably straightforward. Basically everything they learn is white magic, and upon mastery you gain access to MP plus 10%, which is fine, I guess, if you have nothing better to put in the slot, but I don't think it's the best support ability out there. Honestly, in order to really understand how the White Mage functions, I think we need to take a closer look at their spell list. At level 1, White Mage gets Cure, Libra, and Poisona. Cure heals any target of your choosing. Usually you want to target an ally with this, but it can in niche situations be useful to heal an enemy, either because you want to keep them alive for some reason, or because you are trying to kill an undead, because anyone with the undead status takes damage from healing effects instead of being healed by them. Cure is also a spell that can be group cast, meaning you can have it target your entire allied party or the entire enemy party. But if you do, its effect will be weakened than if you cast it on a single individual. Libra is essentially an examine or tattle skill. It lets you see the enemy's HP and any weaknesses that they might have. And Poisona cures poison. Very simple, very straightforward, but very useful. Poison is a debilitating status in the early game, and this saves money on antidotes. Heck, I would argue even later on, poison is still obnoxious because your HP values aren't as high as you would like, even on tankier characters. At level 2, White Mage gets Silence, Protect, and Mini. Silence attempts to inflict the silence status on someone, which prevents them from casting spells. Meanwhile, Protect inflicts the Protect status on someone, which halves all physical damage that would be coming towards them. Typically, you want to silence enemies and protect allies, but you do technically have the option to target whoever you want with them. Although it's worth noting that a lot of bosses are immune from the silence effect, so this has more limited application against them. Mini, on the other hand, is both a status infliction and a status curing spell, as against anyone not inflicted with Mini, it will attempt to make them miniature, but against anyone who is inflicted with Mini, it will restore them to the regular size. When miniaturized, a character's defense drops to 0 and they deal significantly less physical damage. However, magical damage is unaffected, and a mini character has more evasion, in part thanks to the fact they're small. So while you typically don't want to cast any negative statuses on your own party members, in niche situations, you could gamble with a dodge tank by miniaturizing your spellcaster to stop them from getting punched. At level 3, White Mage gets Cura, Raise, and Confuse. Cura is just a stronger version of Cure. It heals for more or damages undead for more, and it can also be group cast. It does cost more MP, but for the most part, once you get Cura, there's not really any reason to click Cure anymore. Raise revives an unconscious ally as if you used a Phoenix down on them. And this is huge in terms of saving money, because Phoenix downs are remarkably expensive. Confuse is a single target status spell that applies the Confuse status to an enemy of your choice. Or I suppose you could target an ally for whatever reason. When a character is confused, they will attack their allies, and if possible, they will even cast healing abilities targeting the enemies. It is worth noting that if a confused character is ever hit by a physical attack, then they will snap out of the status, and sometimes confused characters will attack themselves. After all, they are a member of their own team. So if this happens, the confused character will snap themselves out of confusion. But otherwise, the main way of curing confusion amongst your own party members is to attack them with a weak character, preferably a caster using a physical weapon. Fortunately, the enemies typically aren't smart enough to think of this, but a confused enemy will sometimes attack themselves anyway and thus break out of confusion. And just like with silence, a lot of bosses are immune to this status, and if so, it's useless against them. At level 4, the White Mage gets Blink, Shell, and Isuna. Blink grants the target the Blink status, which prevents the next 2 physical attacks targeting them. Basically, Knight's Guard but on steroids, although it comes much later in the game, so I still think there is utility to Knight in the early game. Shell is basically the magical version of Protect. It gives a target the Shell status, which halves the magical damage they receive instead of their physical damage. And Isuna is a status curing move that can cure basically any status. The only exceptions are the Zombified status and the Doom status. At level 5, the White Mage gets Curaga, Reflect, and Berserk. Curaga is a full heal spell, and while it costs a hefty bit of mana, it is absolutely worth using, and definitely an upgrade over Cure and Cura. Reflect applies the Reflect status to a target of your choice. This status makes it so that any spells targeting them will bounce backwards and hit the enemy team instead. And typically this is a really strong way of protecting from enemy spellcasters. However, there are some other weird applications to it. The major downside is this bounces healing magic towards the enemies, so if you have someone with Reflect, you can never heal them. However, that is also a decent reason to cast Reflect onto an enemy, as if somebody uses a healing spell on the enemy, it will instead backfire and heal your party, which can be the difference between life and death. Berserk is another status that is applicable to inflict on either enemies or allies. Berserk causes the target to go berserked. They get a damage boost, but are unable to do anything other than standard attacks. And in fact, if you berserk an ally, you lose control of them. They will just attack willy-nilly. This is useful for casting on physical allies, such as the aforementioned Knight and Monk, since it will cause them to deal much more physical damage, which is their kind of one-dimensional role. However, it can also be useful if cast against enemy spellcasters, as a berserked spellcaster is a lot less threatening than one who can target you with their spells. And unlike other statuses, even if a boss is immune to Berserk, that doesn't mean the spell is useless, since you can use it to buff your allies. At level 6, White Mage gets Arise, Holy, and Dispel. Arise, similar to Rise, is a revival spell, however, it heals a KO'd ally to full HP, which is incredibly useful. Holy is White Mage's only offensive attacking spell, and the primary way of dealing holy damage to enemies. It is an incredibly powerful attack, and especially good against anyone who is vulnerable to the holy element. Although, in the late game, there's a surprising number of foes that are actually absorbent to the holy element, so your mileage may vary. Lastly, Dispel is used to dispel any magical effects, and can remove positive statuses from enemies. Specifically, it removes the effects of Haste, Shell, Protect, and Reflect, all of which are very annoying to deal with when enemies have them up, as they will severely cut down on your damage or increase the frequency of enemy attacks. You can also potentially use Dispel to remove Reflect from your own characters if you need to heal them and don't have any way of doing so that wouldn't get reflected off of them. Overall, I think the White Mage has a very versatile toolkit and can perform a lot of utility tasks that make it have a spot on the majority of teams. Although they're not as essential as they were in past entries, as you do get access to other jobs that can fulfill the healing role in a different way from the White Mage. If White Mage is your basic utility caster, Black Mage is a much more straightforward offensive caster. And this is even reflected in the weapons they can equip. Black Mage lacks staff access, so they can't use the healing staff, but they can use rods and knives, which are actual weapons to deal damage to foes with standard attacks. And rods in particular oftentimes have special qualities such as boosting specific elemental damage, or potentially casting spells upon use. Black Mage also has a higher magic modifier than White Mage does, and they get MP plus 30% upon mastery instead of MP plus 10%, both of which present the Black Mage as sort of the superior caster. Although it's worth noting their -2 stamina adjustment means they are slightly frailer than the White Mage is. And knives and rods might be actual weapons, but the Black Mage still has a -9 strength modifier, so they're not dealing tons of damage with them. It's just a better option than bonking stuff with staves. Still, the real bread and butter is in the Black Mage's spell list, and this will be a lot faster than the White Mage's. The level 1 spells, Fire, Blizzard, and Thunder, are all just different flavors of the same thing. They are either single target or group cast attacks of Fire, Ice, and Thunder element. The level 2 spells, Poison, Sleep, and Toad, likewise inflict the Poison status, the Sleep status, or the Toad status, although Toad can also be used to cure the Toad status, interestingly enough. Poison causes you to slowly lose HP over time. Sleep makes a target unable to act, although they will be woken up if hit by a physical attack. And Toad turns the character into a frog, which severely reduces their offenses and defenses, stops them from using the majority of special abilities, and, most importantly, makes them have a funny Toad sprite. As with other statuses, be on the lookout to see which bosses are immune from these, but against regular enemies, have at it. They tend to be quite useful. At level 3, Black Mage gets Fyra, Blizzara, and Thundara, which are just upgraded versions of Fire, Blizzard, and Thunder. But at level 4, they get Drain, Break, and Bio. Drain is a non-elemental magical attack that absorbs the target's health in order to heal the Black Mage. Although it is worth noting, if you use Drain against an undead foe, you will heal the undead character and damage the Black Mage, since all healing effects are reversed on undead. Break applies the Petrify status to a foe, which, if successful, turns them into a statue who cannot act, and functionally kind of acts like an Oko move. Although, say it with me, most bosses are immune to this ability, so it has limited application against anything other than standard enemies. And even against standard enemies, the hit chance is going to be questionable. Bio is a strong poison elemental attack that attempts to inflict the sap and poison statuses, each of which cause some damage over time to foes if successful. And since we're talking about damaging spells, level 5 is once again just the Fire, Ice, Thunder trifecta, with Fyraga, Blizzaga, and Thundaga. Your strongest elemental spells of those families, and incredibly powerful moves for taking on the late game. These can be MP intensive to spam, but thankfully level 6 provides an answer, as your level 6 spells are Flare, Death, and Osmose. Osmose is the answer to your MP worries because it is a drain ability that targets the enemy's MP and restores your MP. Any damage inflicted doesn't actually affect the enemy's health, but instead their MP pool. Although this effect is kind of pointless because most enemies have such large MP pools that you're never going to stop them from spellcasting that way. However, if you are going through a dungeon, Osmose is the best way to refill your mana to keep spamming powerful black magic in order to not have to spend a fortune on ethers. Death is a spell that attempts to inflict instant death on foes, although most bosses are immune from this, and a lot of regular enemies are as well. Basically anything with the heavy status is unable to be affected by death spells. And additionally, there are some enemies that are not considered heavy, but do have death immunity, so yeah, this spell's kind of the odd one out. But Flare is a very strong single-target non-elemental spell, and it can be useful for getting around enemies with elemental immunities or elemental absorption. Although, once again, Flare is incredibly MP intensive, and I honestly think if you want to deal damage to foes, sticking with the level 5 spells is probably going to give you more bang for your buck. It's also worth noting that Flare cannot be group cast, unlike the Fire, Blizzard, and Thunder families. And while this doesn't matter that much against bosses, against standard enemy encounters, group casting is a big way of dealing damage. Honestly, I love the Black Mage. In both the long and short term, I think they are easily the strongest of the Wind Crystal jobs. Their spells can pierce enemy defenses, potentially inflict statuses, and if they target elemental weaknesses, they get a 1.5 times damage boost. Plus, the ability to group cast helps against weaker encounters or bosses that have adds you want to get rid of. It's also worth noting that the Black Mage can stealthily become a Red Mage if you equip the White Magic ability to it. And while this is also true of the White Mage, since White Mage has lower stats and worse weapon access, I think typically you want your Black Mage to equip White Magic as opposed to having a White Mage equip Black Magic. Of course, there is one other option for combining healing with offenses, and that is the Blue Mage, which is an exceptionally weird job, which is why I wanted to talk about it last. Initially, it most resembles the Red Mage, as it is a magical class capable of wielding swords, shields, and even light armor. It also, for some reason, gets access to the FF5 Scholar skills of Check, which lets you check an enemy's HP, and Scan, which lets you scan their weaknesses. However, unlike the Red Mage, it doesn't have access to white or black magic. Instead, it has its own separate tree known as Blue Magic. And these spells can't be purchased in stores or found in treasure chests. Instead, the way you acquire blue magic is by getting hit by specific enemy attacks. There are 30 enemy abilities in FF5 that are considered to be blue magic spells, and if anyone with the learning ability is hit by one of these attacks, you will learn that spell and it'll be added to the Blue Mage's spellbook. As such, the Blue Mage technically has access to more spells than any other caster. And they have a very diverse toolkit, with some spells inflicting statuses, some spells inflicting damage, and one spell arguably being the best healing move in the game. But acquiring these 30 spells is a monumental task, and some of them are particularly difficult to find or even trick enemies into using. I mentioned they have a healing spell, which is White Wind, but in order to acquire it, you need to use a different job to mind control an enemy into casting White Wind on your party. And that's before even factoring in that you need to have someone with the learning skill in order to actually learn the spell. So if you're trying to learn Aurora, but they're not targeting your Blue Mage, you're fresh out of luck. You can, of course, get the learning ability by leveling up Blue Mage and equip that to some other job or all 4 of your party members, but then you're working at another disadvantage because suddenly you can't have any secondary abilities equipped on your team. Because there are so many different blue magic spells and you get them at varying points in the campaign, I don't want to go over all of them at this point. Instead, I hope for this video to act as a sort of guide for acquiring the Blue Magic Spellbook, and at the time that we get each new Blue Magic spell, I'll talk about them in turn. And as it so happens, upon getting the Wind Crystal jobs, there are actually 3 different Blue Magic spells easily available to you. Those being Goblin Punch, Aura, and Vampire. Now, normally with each Final Fantasy video, I include a companion piece on my side channel, Ice Rider, that is a tier list or character ranking of that specific Final Fantasy. Yeah, for anyone who doesn't know, if you want to see my tier list of the FF3 jobs or my ranking of the FF2 companions, they are on Ice Rider. I just don't think they would appeal to as many people, so I didn't want them clogging up people's algorithms. Link down below, though, if you're interested. However, in this case, because the FF5 video is going to be diving so deep into the mechanics of this game, I think it just makes sense to include the tier list in this video. After all, I'd kind of just be repeating myself if I made another video ranking these jobs after going in depth on all of them in this video. So, checking in on the tier list post Wind Crystal, I've got the Black Mage and Blue Mage in S tier. Although I have Black Mage slightly above Blue Mage because while Blue Mage does have a more versatile kit, it also requires a lot of work to get to its full potential, and I think that's something that's valid to penalize it for. Meanwhile, Black Mage can do its job basically for free. It just casts really strong spells, and as it turns out, that's good enough in Final Fantasy V. In A tier, I've got the Knight and the White Mage. Knight is a solid carry in the early game, and I think it has long-term potential more than many of the other physical jobs, especially since this is where you get two-handed from. So if you want to pivot into a different physical job, it's still worth your time to spend a little bit of ADP on Knight. White Mage, similarly, is super useful early on as your only healer for the first 2 crystals, but even once you get access to other forms of healing like Chemist, Nightingale, or White Wind, I don't think any of them strictly outclass White Mage, and instead, at best, feel like a side grade. Especially when you factor in White Mage's other powerful utility spells of Berserk, Shell, and Protect. In B tier, I have the Monk, for similar reasons to Knight, as it is a physical job that peaks early. However, unlike the Knight, I don't think it scales particularly well into the mid or end game. Having the highest strength and stamina is nice for potential freelancer builds, and Focus is a genuinely useful skill, but other than that, I'm not a huge fan of anything Monk brings to the table after you get out of the first world. I guess Barehanded has some niche applications since it is the earliest equipment and it gives Monk super high strength modifier, so if you're trying to master a high ADP job such as Red Mage, it can be nice just to replace your basic attack with a slightly stronger one, but even this feels like a pretty big edge case. Honestly, Monk kind of is the Jagan of Final Fantasy V, but at least it's in a better position than Thief, which is the only Wind Crystal job I've ranked at C, although I do still think it's useful. Obviously, the high agility is nice if you're trying to do a freelancer build, but Steel is also sometimes a little bit slept on. Early on, it can help your economy, and later, Steel is necessary for some unique items. Additionally, Thief's utility skills are nice in adding quality of life to your playthrough. Sprint in particular is helpful during the self-destructing castle sequence if you want to get all the optional treasures, and preventing back attacks or auto-fleeing from foes is a godsend anytime your party is at low HP. In remakes, thanks to the inclusion of encounter toggles or automatic sprinting, the Thief does get a little bit worse, but even there, I don't think I would rank it as low as D tier. It does bring enough to the table to justify an inclusion outside of memes. Lastly, I just want to note I'm not going to be ranking Freelancer on this list. It's a super weird job whose strength really depends on your willingness to grind. It's not quite Onion Knight level, where I think it's never actually worth it, But it not only requires a lot of game knowledge, but also a decent amount of patience if you want to make the most of it on your playthrough. It also naturally just gets better in the Pixel Remaster Remake, since you can turn on ABP multipliers and master jobs a lot faster than intended, which further throws a wrench in the spanner and makes it kind of annoying to rank, so I've decided to avoid that pitfall altogether. But with that being said, we will periodically check in on this tier list as we get access to new jobs, and I rank them. This time around, our only physical class is the Berserker, and it's a strange one. With high stamina and high strength, Berserker seems like a straightforward bruiser similar to Monk or Knight. However, thanks to its only innate ability Berserk, it is permanently outside of the player's control. That's because at the start of battle, the Berserk status is applied to the Berserker, and it never wears off and cannot be cured or it will immediately reapply itself. When a unit is berserked, they will constantly do their standard attack at a random enemy every time their ATB bar fills up. However, in exchange for this, the berserked unit gains a 50% increase to the damage they deal. As such, despite the berserker's strength modifier only being plus 21, they deal the most with standard physical attacks out of any of the basic physical jobs. And while the permanent berserk status might seem like a bit of a downside, if we're being realistic, just clicking attack is the sort of thing that your monk and knight do for a lot of fights. The main downsides of the perma berserk, therefore, are really just the inability to pick targets, which can sometimes be a problem, and the fact you can't pivot your berserker to throw out a high potion or phoenix down in case of emergency. As such, I think that this initially off-putting job is actually a little bit underrated, but that's not to say it doesn't have its limitations. Physical jobs scale more and more poorly the longer the game goes on, and since Berserker is the most simplistic of them, it's oftentimes going to be amongst the first to have a major falloff. Not only that, but Berserker's agility modifier of -9 is really unfortunate for a job that just wants to attack as frequently as possible. It's worth noting that in the SNES and GBA versions, there is a bug associated with the Berserker that makes its ATB gauge fill up far less than it should. But even with the Pixel Remaster, or my fan translation, which I later learned also included some bug fixes, the Berserker's going to get less turns than your other party members for the most part. But by far the biggest issue Berserker has to contend with is in regards to its unique weapon types, axes, and hammers. These are, as you might expect, amongst the strongest weapons in the game, but they're also some of the least accurate ones. The game's two accuracy boosting skills, aim and X attack, are both command abilities, which means they are off limits to the Berserker. And as such, you are going to see the miss icon appear above their heads more often than other jobs. But if that's not enough RNG for you, the damage calculations for axes and hammers have an inherent bit of RNG as well, as they can deal anywhere from 50% to 150% of their calculated damage. This means sometimes the Berserker hits really hard, but in other occasions, they hit like a wet noodle, and much less hard than you would expect them to, as well as less hard compared to other physical jobs. So between the random target, the random accuracy, and the random damage, Berserker is a gambler's wet dream. But I also think it comes early enough that it can still be useful in the upcoming dungeons, especially if you're willing to work with them by giving them a skill like two-handed or equip swords. Although, ironically, the knight and monk jobs might just make for a better Berserker, since you can just give them the Berserk skill after you inherit it from Berserker, and not have to deal with any of the axe nonsense while still getting all of the upsides of a perma-berserked party member. While Berserker is the only purely physical job in this lot, Mystic Knight functions as a sort of hybrid between the magical and physical jobs. In fact, it's the only job in the game with entirely positive modifiers for all four stats. Although, as you might expect, this results in not exactly stellar stats in any particular area. 14 strength makes its physical attack decent, but certainly not comparable to other physical classes, and a magic modifier of 1 might as well be nothing. Sure, it's technically better than being in the negative, but just barely. Any spells you fire off are going to be incredibly weak. But I would encourage you not to write this class off on its stats alone, as the Mystic Knight comes with one of the stronger abilities in the game. No, not Auto Shell, that's kind of weird and not really useful. It casts the Shell spell targeting yourself whenever you hit low HP, but honestly, I found that even with Shell, the next spell would kill me because my HP was that low. Instead, I think the most powerful part of Mystic Knight's toolkit is its active command, Spellblade. Spellblade almost entirely copies Black Magic's spell list, with the only differences being Toad at level 2 is replaced by Silence from White Mage, and Death at level 6 is replaced with Holy, also from White Magic. However, rather than targeting the enemy with these spells, Spellblade enchants your weapon with the chosen element or spell attribute. This overwrites potential elemental damage that is innate to your weapon, and instead gives a brand new effect depending on what spell you cast. For Break, Poison, Silence, and Sleep, you will deal your regular damage and be guaranteed to inflict the status of either Petrification, Poison, Sleep, or Silence. Assuming, of course, your target isn't immune to that status condition. For the attacking spells, things get a lot more interesting. You imbue your weapon with the element of choice, being Fire, Ice, Thunder, Poison, or Holy, and as such, for purposes of dealing effective damage, it is treated as that element, which can be either an upside or a downside. If you enchant your blade with fire and you are attacking something fire weak, you deal extra damage, but if you enchant your blade with fire and attack something fire immune or fire absorbent, then instead you'll deal no damage or potentially even heal it. However, the way this damage is calculated is different from other forms of elemental weakness, as the multiplier for dealing effective damage goes up depending on which tier of spell you cast. I'm getting these numbers from the fandom wiki, so take it with a grain of salt, but for the tier 1 spells, being Fire, Blizzard, Thunder, and Poison, effective damage is treated as a 2x multiplier. For the tier 2 spells, Fyra, Blizzara, and Thundara, effective damage is a 3x multiplier. For the tier 3 spells, it gets a little bit complicated, and depends on whether or not the enemy is classified as heavy, which is a modifier given to most bosses and a lot of standard enemies. Heavy enemies will instantly die if hit by a specific weakness from Bio, Fyraga, Blizzaga, Thundaga, or Holy. And this will actually pierce through, otherwise being immune to instant death. However, it does not kill any heavy classified enemies. Instead, heavy enemies will take 4 times effective damage if hit by one of their weaknesses. The Drain Spellblade is basically what you expect. It turns all of your attacks into a vampiric force, so you will heal up any damage you deal, which is especially powerful and can make your Spellblade feel nearly immortal. Flare just deals a bunch of extra non-elemental damage to the target, and it can be used to reset your Spellblade if you've accidentally set up a Fire Spellblade to someone who is immune to fire, since it removes all elemental properties from the Spellblade in question. Meanwhile, the Osmose spell steals MP from the target. However, unlike you would expect, it doesn't steal the MP equal to how much damage you dealt. Instead, if you deal any damage, it steals 1/4 of the target's MP, meaning you can completely zero out a target's MP by hitting them with 4 Osmose Spellblades, and therefore shut off any spellcasters basically entirely. Obviously, Spellblade is very powerful, and I would argue it's usually better than straight-up black magic. However, it gets even better once you realize that the spells themselves are cheaper to cast as a Spellblade than as a black mage. For example, looking at the tier 1 spells, Fire, Blizzard, and Thunder each cost 5 MP to cast. However, if you use them as a Spellblade, they're only 2 MP apiece. And this pattern continues with the higher level spells, with almost every Spellblade being about 50% the price of casting the same spell as a Black Mage. I assume the reason for this is the devs thought having to wait an extra turn makes it less powerful, and against weak enemies that is certainly the case, but against strong foes that you're going to want to hit with multiple attacks, Spellblade is absolutely the better option. And that's before thinking of the synergies with things like dual wield, X attack, and other attack boosting commands. This is truly a stupidly strong job. Although it's not even my favorite of the Water Crystal jobs, because Time Mage is an incredibly powerful support job. The main appeal here is time magic, although it's worth noting upon mastering Time Mage, you gain access to equip rods. Although realistically, this ability is equip rods and staves, as it gives you access to both of the mage's go-to weapons. Still, that's not why I'm personally such a big fan of Time Mage. No, instead that's because Time Magic as a school has some really stellar utility spells. Specifically, as it comes to speed manipulation. They can inflict the slow status on enemies with slow, which is single target, or slow ga, which targets everyone, and cuts the rate at which your ATB bar fills up in half. Alternatively, they can speed up allies with Haste, which is a single target spell, or Haste-ga, which targets the entire party, and, as you can expect, doubles the rate at which your ATB bar fills up. And these 4 spells alone are phenomenal, as they basically give you double or even quadruple the number of actions you normally would, if you manage to slow down the enemy and haste your entire team. But it gets better, because Time Mage also has access to a suite of situational but useful support spells. The Regen spell applies the regen effect to an ally of your choice, causing them to slowly regain health over time. Not as effective as a White Mage or other healers, but it can be a nice top-off, and especially if the battle goes long, does more work than you would expect. Meanwhile, Float gives an ally the Float status, granting them immunity to all Earth-based elemental attacks. Again, quite situational, but useful when it comes up. Silence attempts to inflict an enemy with the Silence status, which prevents them from spellcasting. And Silence can be group cast, although this lowers the success rate of inflicting the status. Stop is an incredibly powerful status effect, which, well, stops the enemy. It stops them from being able to do any attacks, and lowers their evasion to 0, meaning that all attacks will be perfectly accurate. However, it's worth noting a lot of foes are immune to this status, but when you can get it off, it is incredibly potent. And similarly, the old status is super debilitating if you can inflict it, as anyone affected by old will slowly have their level tick down over time. While your level doesn't impact your basic stats, it is factored into calculation when it comes to damage. So inflicting someone with old will very quickly turn them from a massive threat into a baby pecking away at you with pathetic attacks. Banish attempts to cast an enemy out of battle, basically instantly killing them, although since it isn't the death status, this does get around death immunity. Worth noting, however, that Banish does not work against heavy targets, and as such, most bosses won't be affected. Banish's inverse spell, Teleport, allows you to flee from a battle for free, and it can be used from the overworld in order to teleport out of a dungeon, which is useful if your team is running low on health or items. The 2 weirdest spells in the Time Mage's arsenal are Speed and Return, sometimes referred to as Reset. Speed adjusts the battle speed to the maximum of 5, which is something you can normally do in the menu anyway, but if you wanted to adjust battle speed using a spell, I guess this works. I can't really see a use case for it, but if anything, it serves as a kind of interesting artifact of the weirdness around Final Fantasy V, still figuring out how various mechanics in QOL would fit into their gameplay systems. And a similar thing can be said about Return, which resets a battle to the starting point, restoring all items, HP, MP, etc. that you've used up. So it basically is a do-over that you can cast as a time mage in case something went wrong in a random encounter or a boss fight and you didn't save anytime recently. Again, this feels like the sort of thing that would normally be thought of as a QOL or even easy mode feature, but it's just part of the Time Mage's toolkit, which is weird but kind of cool and sort of a sign of the times. Gravity and Graviga are the two main damage-dealing spells Time Mage gets, with Gravity dealing 1/8 of its current HP, and Graviga dealing half of its current HP. Although, before you get too excited, these don't work on heavy targets, so say it with me, against most bosses, these will be useless. Instead, if you want your Time Mage to deal damage to them, Comet and Meteor are non-elemental damage, with Comet being single target and Meteor being multi-target. Although the damage these spells deal is entirely random, and as such can be pretty low or pretty high, depending on how lucky you get. Personally, if I'm trying to deal damage, I like more reliable sources like physical attackers, black mages, and summoners, but if you're a gambling addict, this could be just the thing you want. Although, I've saved the best spell on the Time Mage's list for last, because Quick is an incredibly potent, if expensive, utility spell, as it immediately gives you 2 additional free turns once you cast it. It's 77 MP, so you can't exactly spam Quick whenever you want, but if you use it at the right time, it can absolutely turn the tide of battle, either letting you clench victory from the jaws of defeat, or pushing you over the finish line against an incredibly difficult foe. Most of my audience is familiar with dancers in Fire Emblem, so I probably don't have to explain this, but extra actions are one of the most powerful things you can do in an RPG. And they're super flexible at that. Getting 2, even with the exorbitant mana cost, is a huge boon. And Quick, in combination with the power of speed manipulation, is a big part of why I personally think Time Mage is the best job in the game. I guess spoilers for the tier list. But before we can look at the tier list, we have 2 more jobs to talk about. And I want to cover Summoner next. Because while Time Mage is a premier utility mage, Summoner is a premier damage-dealing mage. It feels like something of a hybrid between the Black Mage and the Blue Mage, as, like the Black Mage, its spells are usually focused on attacking, and get divided up into 5 different spell levels, but like the Blue Mage, fully filling out your summon spellbook feels like something of a side quest that lasts almost the entire game. You can purchase the first 3 spells, Chocobo, Sylph, and Remora, but all of the other ones are going to require you to do some sort of side quest or reach a specific point in the main story. As such, I'll be treating this job like the Blue Mage and highlighting the ways in which we can acquire new summons when we reach them. And instead of going over all of the summons in the game at this juncture, I'll cover them when we acquire them. Although with that in mind, I do want to talk about the 3 purchasable summons, Chocobo, Sylph, and Remora, which make up the Summoner's level 1 spellbook. Chocobo is a single target spell which deals non-elemental damage against the target. However, it has an RNG chance of summoning the Fat Chocobo instead, which will attack all enemies instead of just one, still dealing non-elemental damage, but considerably more of it than the individual Chocobo would. Sylph deals non-elemental damage to one target enemy as well. However, its secondary effect isn't RNG. Instead, it heals the party for the amount of damage dealt. This is usually a rather small heal, but it's useful at topping up party members and keeping the party consistently healthy if you are attacking with Sylph over and over again. And Remora is a status-inflicting attack which attempts to paralyze one enemy. Paralysis takes an enemy out of the fight temporarily, meaning they can't do any attacks or even fill up their ATB bar, which is pretty useful if you can inflict it, although many bosses are immune to this status effect. I personally don't think the level 1 spells are particularly standout, but they're a nice baseline to get your summoner started, and as I said, moving forward, I will attempt to guide you into filling out the summon spellbook entirely. Although, it's worth noting that thanks to the summoner's final ability, Call, you might not actually want to fill out your entire summon spellbook, because Call costs 0 MP and summons a random summon of the ones that you have. So if you only acquire a few specific summons, you can more definitively boost the odds of Call being exactly what you want in your favor. This, of course, limits the flexibility that the summoner has, as part of the benefits of the summon job is it's able to inflict elemental damage with a wide variety of elements. It has access to fire, ice, lightning, earth, water, wind, and non-elemental damage, alongside some status-inflicting and utility moves. And all of these are incredibly powerful attacks, but they also cost a lot of MP. And as such, especially when going against regular enemies in a dungeon, the Black Mage often feels preferable to the summoner unless you have a very specific build laid out which compensates for the MP cost. After 3 extremely powerful spellcasters, the last job from the Water Crystal feels pretty underwhelming. And that's because it's the classic Red Mage. And Red Mage doesn't really work under Final Fantasy V's job system. You see, the idea behind Red Mage is combining black magic and white magic alongside decent physical attack into one package. So you have a party member who's not great at anything, but is okay at a few different things. And while this can be a decent form of role compression in the first few Final Fantasies, in FF5, it's not really needed. If you want someone to do both black and white magic, you can just utilize the job system to give a black mage white magic, or vice versa. And in that case, you wouldn't have to deal with the red mage's abysmal stats, or the fact they can only cast spells up to level 3. This does give a decent selection for the mid-game, with the aura spells, raise, and cura all being available, but you miss out on crucial things in the late game, like the Aga spells Asuna or Arise. And as far as being a physical attacker goes, the Red Mage is worse at that than basically any other physical job. From this description, it might seem like Red Mage is useless, and I do think it's a pretty bad job, but it does at least have one selling point, and that is the skill you get upon mastering Red Mage: Dual Cast. Dual Cast allows you to cast 2 spells back to back for your turn. So it's similar to Time Mage's Quick in giving you extra actions, although it's less flexible. The ideal use case for Dual Cast is to use 2 very strong attacking spells back to back. Although you can also use a strong attack and a heal, or multiple healing spells if those are more situationally useful. But despite how powerful Dual Cast is, I'm not sure it does enough to salvage the Red Mage. Mastering Red Mage takes a lot of work, and you're either going to do a ton of grinding, or get Dual Cast very late into the game. Which is not terrible, having Dual Cast for the late game bosses is super useful, but it means compromising the early and mid game by having a Red Mage as one of your party members. And while Red Mage is not useless, they're certainly underwhelming as compared to the other job options. This also limits your team's flexibility, as a large part of tackling the challenges FF5 throws at you is changing up your team composition. But if you are desperately trying to get dual cast as quickly as possible, you're going to want to leave the same character in Red Mage for basically their entire career. And as such, once they come out of Red Mage, they'll also have less flexible options for the late game, with basically dual cast being the only tool in their toolkit worth using. Although dual cast itself is very strong and can probably outclass a multi-tool. It's for that reason I've got Red Mage in C tier. It's never a job you especially want to be in, it's just one you have to be in for a very long time if you want the payoff of dual cast. Dual cast itself is very strong, but I think that there are other broken things you can do that require a lot less effort than mastering Red Mage. And many of those broken things come from the Water Crystal, which is why Summoner, Time Mage, and Mystic Knight all make their way into S tier, which might give you an indication as to just how strong the jobs in this game are, as S tier is by far the most crowded tier and we're only 2 crystals deep. Sure, there's a few stinkers we're gonna run into, but for the most part, the jobs in Final Fantasy V are incredibly powerful. Even Berserker, which has noticeable and significant drawbacks, I only have as low as B tier, because I think it is useful at the time you get it. Sure, physical jobs fall off eventually, and Berserker is completely out of your control, but like I said during the overview, just clicking attack is what Knight and Monk do 90% of the time anyway. So Berserker being berserked isn't as much of a downside as it initially seems. Their real issue is being stuck with axes, which are a mediocre weapon type at best. I'm sure having them in the bottom of B tier is going to raise some eyebrows, but it's a stance that I'm sticking with. Berserker is overhated. The Geomancer is another class with all 4 positive modifiers, although unlike the Mystic Knight, its stats are much more min-maxed, with a 24 magic modifier and everything else being single digits. As such, you can probably guess that the Geomancer is a mage class, although it functions much differently from the other magical jobs. And this is most prominently seen in its equipment, as it's incapable of equipping either rods or stabs. And the latter is especially relevant because that means, along with the White Mage, it's one of the only magical classes that can't use rod breaking. Instead, they have access to probably the most neglected weapon type, bells. There's a grand total of 4 bells available in the game, although for the majority of the campaign you only have access to 1, the Diamond Bell. The remaining 3 do not become available until you have access to the final dungeon in the game. Because of this level of neglect, it's probably unsurprising that the Geomancer doesn't actually get an equip ability for its weapon type. In fact, leveling up the Geomancer doesn't give you much. You get 2 dungeon exploration abilities, Find Pits, which lets you see upcoming pitfalls, and Light Step, which prevents you from falling into them. But neither of these are huge selling points for the job as a whole. Instead, its premier ability is its School of Magic, Gaia, or Terrain Magic, depending on the translation. Although, referring to this as a School of Magic may be a little bit misleading, as it doesn't function like any of the other schools. You don't purchase or collect your spells for Terrain Magic. Instead, anytime you select the Gaia command, your Geomancer will cast a random spell which is pulled from a pool determined by your current geographical location. There are 23 total of these spells, although each given location has between 1 to 4 that it can pull from. And these effects can vary widely in potency. For example, looking at the forest terrain, Geomancer has 4 very different spells. Bindweed is functionally a free copy of Sloaga, whereas Branch Arrow and Branch Spear are just physical attacks of varying power. Meanwhile, Leaf Swirl is a wind elemental attack that attempts to inflict the blind status on all enemies. Because you don't know which of these 4 effects your Geomancer is going to cast, you can't really plan around things, and instead have to adjust to the RNG. which can be a fun playstyle if that's what you're looking for, but it is an undeniably weaker playstyle than having carefully planned lines with spells whose effects you know. Although there is one major advantage the Geomancer gets in exchange for its random spells, and that is all-terrain magic costs 0 MP. You don't know what spell you're going to get, but you know you won't be paying anything for it. And as such, Gaia can be a valuable tool if running through dungeons and fighting hordes of random encounters. While black mages and summoners need to conserve their mana if they want to be useful against the boss, a Geomancer faces no such obstacles. And since Gaia is the first skill you inherit from Geomancer, it's fairly easy to slap it on a black mage, white mage, or any other caster in order to give them something to do on turns where their more potent spellcasting isn't needed. And in most dungeons, the Geomancers have a spell that is at least neutral against the majority of enemies. So it's not like all of their attacks will uselessly be absorbed because they're using fire magic in a volcano or something. Rather than spend the next 20 minutes going over every spell in the Geomancer's arsenal and detailing where in the world you can cast each of them, I'm instead going to bring up the Geomancer's spells when I think they are particularly relevant for a dungeon or boss encounter, either because they are potent or because they are useless. If I don't say anything, it's safe to assume that the Geomancer just has okay spells. Good enough for random encounters, but rarely of the caliber you want for a crucial boss fight. In a similar vein as the Geomancer, the Beastmaster has a lot of theoretical possibilities in its moveset, but in practice, it's limited by the implementation of its capture mechanic. You see, the keystone ability of the Beastmaster, Catch, allows them to capture an enemy who is at 1/8 or lower HP. Then, either in this battle or a later one, they can release their captured enemy in order to do a special attack. Usually, this attack is just a standard damage-dealing move, although it tends to be far more powerful than what you could do with your standard attacks. But certain captured abilities are even better, as instead of using the standard strong attack, they'll use one of their special abilities. For example, if you backtrack to the Wind Shrine and capture one of the wizards there, you can actually gain super early access to the Death spell. And this is a black magic spell that is normally only accessible in the later stretches of the game. And even if you're not willing to go to the wiki and find all of the best captures, it's generally safe to assume that if you capture a monster that does a standard attack, they're gonna hit hard and it's gonna be a worthwhile use of your action. It's just a matter of doing the preparation. And unfortunately, that's where Beastmaster fails. Because reducing an enemy to 1/8 HP without accidentally killing them is a surprisingly difficult task. And this is made even more difficult by the fact that enemy HP values are not displayed, so unless you can do quick math, you kinda gotta wing it and go off of vibes. Technically, using percentage-based attacks like harps and gravity help you reduce things with a more precise, non-lethal edge. And there is a side quest you can do in the mid-game for an accessory which changes the criteria from 1/8 HP to 1/2. Which is much easier to meet. But at that point, you have to wonder if the exorbitant amount of preparation you're doing is even worth it for the payoff you receive. Especially since, presumably due to hardware limitations, each character can only have one captured monster at a time. Once you capture a monster, the catch command is replaced with release. And of course, once you release a monster and use its ability, you then are able to capture a new one, but that means you're in the preparation stage all over again. And it also means if you're trying to use Beastmaster for a difficult encounter, such as a boss fight, you're going to have at most 4 uses of the release command, and that's only if you have every single character in Beastmaster. Don't get me wrong, there are absolutely some useful captures, and I'll try to point out a few here and there as we go through the rest of the campaign, but in general I find the extensive amount of preparation needed alongside the monster limit of 1 turns catch into a much more niche command than anything else you have access to. But thankfully, catch isn't all the Beastmaster brings to the table, as arguably more important than catch is their level 2 ability, Control. This allows the Beastmaster to attempt to take control of an enemy on the battlefield. Initially, they have a 40% success rate, but much like with capture, there's an associated accessory which improves the odds up to 75%. And when you take control of an enemy, on the Beastmaster's turn, instead of them attacking or choosing an action, you can direct the controlled enemy to choose an action of your liking. The most obvious application of this is turning your enemy's powerful moves against them. However, you can also use it as an easy way of learning blue magic. It's particularly helpful for the support spells that enemies normally wouldn't use on you, but I also found that Control was a nice time saver in order to help enemies target the blue mage instead of some of my non-learning party members. It's worth noting that Control works similarly to the Confuse or Sleep statuses, in that it can be interrupted if the enemy is ever hit by a physical attack. But other than that, Control lasts until the end of battle. The last ability Beastmaster gets through level up is Calm, which is basically its own version of the Stop spell. It only works against magical beasts, but will always be successful against them, so that's kind of cool, but personally, I'll stick with Time Mage for my Stop shenanigans. Before moving on, I should also talk about Beastmaster's unique weapon type, the Whips. These ignore row like other ranged weapons, and have a chance to paralyze. In theory, this is cool, and it gives the Beastmaster something to do once they've used up their catch in a boss fight, but in practice, I find that their combat is still pretty abysmal, even with whips factored in. Personally, I'd much rather just go for consistent damage instead of gamble on Paralyze, a status which many enemies are immune to. On that topic, let's talk about the ninja, who's probably the best character at launching basic attacks, in large part due to its innate ability Dual Wield. Dual Wield allows you to hold a weapon in both hands. And, much like unarmed attacks, you get to hit the enemy twice with each attack. Once with your left-hand weapon, and once with your right-hand weapon. And this means, on average, in comparison to other classes, the ninja will be dealing twice as much damage. Although, oftentimes the math is even more generous in the ninja's favor, because they have an incredibly high agility modifier of 14, only 2 less than the thief's maximum of 16. So not only will they be launching 2 attacks every turn, but their turns come around more often than the average job. And their unique weapon type, short swords, lean into this by boosting agility when equipped. So if you dual wield short swords, not only do you launch 2 powerful attacks per turn, but your turns come around more often than any other character. And that damage stacks up over the course of a long battle. And even in random encounters, this speed advantage is useful, especially alongside Ninja's other passive, First Strike, which increases your chances of getting advantage on random enemy encounters. If all Ninja could do was attack really well, I still think they would be worth using. But what really elevates them to a high-tier job is the flexibility they get with their various activated commands. There's 3 of these in total: Smoke, Image, and Throw. Smoke is identical to Thief's Flee, in that it lets you freely escape a random encounter. And Image is a 0 MP version of the White Mage's Blink spell. It's probably unnecessary if you have a dedicated White Mage in the party, but if you don't, Blink is still a pretty good status effect, so it's nice to have another way to apply it. Still, the real star of the show is Throw, which Ninja has innately and learns at level 4. This allows them to throw a weapon at the enemy for massive damage. There's a slightly convoluted damage formula that results in higher damage with higher might weapons, but regardless of what you throw, you're typically going to be dealing more damage than you would with a standard attack. And as such, this is a nice way of turning those lower tier weapons you've grown out of into big damage numbers against bosses. But it actually gets even better than that, because FF5 features some dedicated throwables. Namely, shurikens and the elemental scrolls. If you throw a shuriken, it does massive damage, far outscaling any other throwable you have. And as such, it's typically going to be best reserved for really difficult encounters. Especially since purchasing shurikens in Bartz's hometown is very expensive. You do find some throughout the overworld, and they can be useful if you hoard them for a particularly dreadful fight, but otherwise, if you want to get full mileage out of shurikens, it's going to require a lot of gil. Thankfully, that statement doesn't apply to the elemental scrolls, as these are a mere 200 gil each, and they are a way of giving the ninja an area attack. These deal elemental damage to all foes, as either fire, water, or lightning depending on which scroll you purchase. Interestingly, water and ice are considered different elements for the sake of effectiveness. But outside of geomancy, scrolls are the only way of dealing water damage, and as such, the water scroll covers an interesting niche in terms of effectiveness. But one interesting thing is that scrolls actually calculate their damage depending upon your magic stat. And since the ninja has a negative magic modifier, you might expect them to be pretty bad in the ninja's hands. But that's not actually the case. The ninja deals genuinely decent AoE damage with these scrolls. And I assume that the reason they're so powerful is to account for the ninja's innate magic bane. But it means if you equip Throw on a magical class like Black Mage or Summoner, you can throw scrolls instead of casting spells and deal massive damage without wasting your MP. And depending on the point in the game you're at, this might actually just be better damage than the spells you would normally access. My main point though is that throwing scrolls gives ninja an additional bit of flexibility, and alongside dual wield and their high agility score, means that ninja is almost always going to have something useful they can do. As for the tier list, I'm putting Ninja at the top of A tier. It's phenomenal at single target attacks, and pretty good at multi-target ones too, but in comparison to the S-rank jobs, it just has a little bit less going on. Smoke, Image, and First Strike aren't useless, but they're more niche than anything. It is, however, far better than both the Geomancer and Beastmaster, which I'm placing in C tier. Beastmaster has a lot of options, but is limited by the single monster capture limit and takes way more setup than it's worth, at least in my opinion. Its main utility, therefore, is enabling blue magic, which is nice and is the easiest way to get some of the more powerful tools, but it always feels like a burden to have a Beastmaster on the team while you're hunting down a new blue spell. Geomancer I have in C tier because its gimmick is a little bit too unreliable. Don't get me wrong, it's nice for saving NP, and in the situations where it's outstanding, it is outstanding. But too often it feels like a worse and less consistent version of Summoner or Black Mage. And once you get the ability to buy scrolls, it's outclassed by Ninja as well. Ranger has seen a major glow up from Final Fantasy III, as bows no longer consume arrows, and Ranger has their own unique skills they can bring to the table, in the form of animals, aim, and rapid fire. Aim is a substitute for a basic attack, which guarantees the hit will always land. And this is particularly nice with bows, since they tend to have pretty bad accuracy. Although it is worth noting any secondary effects of your weapon will not go off if you're using aim, which is usually a downside, although it can be beneficial if you're using a weapon with a negative secondary effect, such as the dancing dagger or the chicken knife. More on those later. The Ranger's mastery skill, Rapid Fire, has the perfect accuracy of aim, but launches 4 attacks instead of 1. albeit each attack is at half damage. The targets for each attack are chosen at random, but even so, you're dealing twice as much damage as you normally would. And that's before factoring in the other strong synergies you can use to make rapid fire even more broken. Spellblade is particularly good with rapid fire, as you can enchant your weapon before launching an attack against every foe. Rapid fire therefore allows you to spread status moves like sleep or poison to all foes. And if they're vulnerable, things like death and break are also really strong options. Or you could just go with the classic and use Drain plus 4 attacks to make your Spellblade basically immortal. Alternatively, if you combine rapid fire with dual wielding, then you launch 8 attacks total instead of just 4. But even if you're not combining it with some of these strong synergies, rapid fire itself is just really strong. It's extra damage and perfect accuracy, both of which are really desirable traits on physical classes that can otherwise struggle going into the late game. The main downside is because the targets are random, you might target back row enemies and end up dealing less damage than you should, but the Ranger kind of naturally works around this problem with their unique weapon type of bows. I already mentioned that bows are fairly inaccurate, presumably to make up for the guaranteed accuracy of aim and rapid fire, but that's not the only notable quality about them. Bows are two-handed, so you can't dual wield them or equip a shield no matter what job you're in. In exchange, however, they ignore row restrictions, meaning that you can put the Ranger in the back row and they end up surprisingly bulky as a light armor wielding back row attacker. And most of the bows you get access to have some special attribute associated with them. Unfortunately, aim and rapid fire overwrite most of those attributes, but at least the starting 3 bows you get have elemental affinities of fire, ice, and thunder, which can potentially allow the Ranger to prey on enemies' elemental weaknesses, an interesting and unique attribute for a physical attacker. The last ability that Ranger gets access to is animals, which allows them to call animal companions that perform a variety of helpful actions. However, much like geomancy, these animals are chosen at random. However, this time, the pool of possibilities is not dependent on your environment, but instead dependent upon your level. You see, anytime you call for animals, the game rolls a random number between 0 and your current level, and depending on what number is rolled, it will call a different animal. This means the higher your level is, the more animals you have access to, but also the more likely it is that they will call a powerful animal. As if you are only level 10, there is just one roll that calls Nightingale. But if you're level 20, there are 10 total rolls that call Nightingale. And many of these animal effects are actually quite powerful. The first 2 kind of feel like failures, since the Masidian Rabbit literally does nothing, and the Squirrel deals some minor damage to a grounded foe, but once you get to the Bee Swarm, things start feeling a lot better. It deals a decent chunk of non-elemental damage to all enemies, and Nightingale is a huge party-wide heal that also has the bonus of curing blindness and poison. The Flying Squirrel gives you a chance to paralyze all foes, which is a pretty debilitating status ailment, and Falcon deals 3/4 of an enemy's remaining HP, similar to a super buff gravity spell. If you do an absurd amount of grinding, you can also get access to Skunk, Wild Boar, and Unicorn, each of which have very powerful effects. Skunk inflicts blindness and poison. Wild Boar is like Squirrel on steroids, dealing a ton of damage to a single grounded enemy, and Unicorn is Nightingale's upgrade, as it simultaneously heals the entire party and deals massive damage to the foes, reducing them to single-digit HP. Although, if I'm being real, if you've grinded all the way up to level 60, you probably have things more powerful than Unicorn. Still, despite its randomness, I do find animals to be quite useful, especially Nightingale and Bee Swarm, for the emergency heal and the party-wide damage, coming at levels where those things are relatively rare even amongst the other jobs. I don't think it's worth running in the late game over other powerful abilities, but since it comes so early on Ranger, I can definitely see a justification for it immediately after the Ranger's unlock. It just compresses a lot of really strong abilities into a single slot, albeit including a touch of randomness that not everyone is gonna want to engage with. And if that's you, then the Bard is kind of the perfect solution to your aversion of randomness, since it also has a bunch of varying abilities, albeit mostly support ones, compressed into a single skill slot, that being Sing. I think technically the Bard is supposed to be a mage, which would make songs its spellbook. They're listed as such in the main menu, but none of them can be used from the overworld and all of them cost 0 MP. So it feels kind of like a middle ground between a martial and magical unit. And their equipment is reflective of this. They're unable to wield any physical weapons other than knives, but they also don't get access to staves or rods, which are typical mage fare. Instead, they have their own unique weapon type, the harps. And with one exception, harps deal percentage-based damage instead of a flat number. Much like bows, harps need to be wielded with 2 hands, so you can't dual wield or have a shield, but this is less of a problem for the Bard since it's not really a tanky class anyway. Instead, the harps mostly serve as a free way to deal minor chip damage when the Bard isn't doing anything else useful with their turn. Although, I personally find the Bard's wasted turns don't come up super often, which might surprise you given the way that Edward worked in Final Fantasy IV. Oftentimes, the best thing Edward could do was use the hide command to remove himself from battle, and therefore stop wasting your time with his ATB gauge. And Bards do get access to the hide ability, but that feels mostly like an Easter egg, rather than something that's meant to actually be useful, because there's no situations I can think of in Final Fantasy V where you want to actively remove a party member from your team. In fact, it's so detrimental that some enemies will actively force you to have a party member removed in the late game. That being said, while hide may be useless, Bard's other ability Sing certainly is not. There are 10 songs in the game with varying effects, and each of them costs 0 MP. Much like with summons, the Bard gathers songs by traveling around the world and completing side quests. And there's actually a few of these available for us right now. Although, before moving on to our side quests, I do want to quickly check in with the tier list, since we have 2 new jobs to put on it. Despite gassing up animals, I do still think Ranger is a C-tier job. The main thing you get out of it is rapid fire, which is phenomenal for any physical job, but much like with the Red Mage, when your mastery skill is your main selling point, I think it says some negative stuff about you as a job. Unlike Red Mage, you don't feel overly burdened with a Ranger while you're building towards Rapid Fire, but I also think Rapid Fire is less impactful than Dual Cast, mostly because physical jobs just tend to be weaker than magical ones. Meanwhile, Bard I have at the top of B tier. I don't think you should underestimate the versatility and power of its support kit, but it's also worth noting that much of that kit gets filled out later in the game than other mages. And at times, Bard can feel like a niche option rather than a generalist. There are some matchups where Bard feels phenomenal, but there's also times when it just feels like a downgrade compared to the other support jobs. I'll start with Dragoon, as it's a pretty straightforward job that feels out of place amongst the more complicated Earth Crystal ones. Dragoon is, for all intents and purposes, just another standard attacking job similar to the Monk, Berserker, and Knight. Its weapon of choice are spears, which are relatively underwhelming as regular attacking options, but combo nicely with the Dragoon's inherent ability of jump. Jump allows a Dragoon to jump high up in the air and eventually come plummeting down, landing an attack on an enemy of their choice. While the Dragoon is airborne, no attacks or abilities can affect them, And this is sometimes a bit of a double-edged sword, because an airborne Dragoon cannot be affected by party-wide buffs and heals, so White Wind and Hasteга will miss them. But at the same time, an airborne Dragoon is great at avoiding enemy AoE attacks. The power of the jump attack depends on your equipped weapon. If you have a spear equipped, it will be double your standard attack. But if you don't, it's just the same might. And considering jump's hang time, it's really only worthwhile if you have a spear. And since Dragoons are the only class that can natively wield spears, jump isn't actually all that useful outside of the Dragoon specifically. And unfortunately, that's kind of their defining factor, because the only other ability Dragoon gets is Lance, and this is an incredibly lame attack. It drains a little bit of HP and a little bit of MP, but not nearly enough to justify having it fill your ability slot. This is especially worthless on Dragoon since they don't natively have any abilities to use MP. And if you really care about the HP draining effect, there's Vampire from Blue Mage or the Drain spell from Black Mage, both of which are only one small part of the job's entire kit. Aside from that, there's not much to say about the Dragoon job. Jump does have some niche applications, but considering this is one of the last jobs you get, there's almost always going to be several better tools for any given situation. At least under-otherwhelming jobs like Monk and Berserker exist at a point where your options are more limited, so they might genuinely be the tool you're looking for. But Dragoon always feels like I'm intentionally handicapping myself. Although, it's definitely not the worst Earth Crystal job, as that award pretty definitively goes to Dancer. Dancer at least has more options than Dragoon does, but most of its options are pretty worthless. Its innate ability Dance is RNG dependent, as it has a 1 in 4 chance of either doing Tempting Tango, Jitterbug Duet, Mystery Waltz, or the Sword Dance. And each of these have different effects. The Jitterbug Duet is an HP draining attack, whereas the Mystery Waltz is an MP draining attack, but both of these are incredibly weak thanks to the Dancer's poor magic stat. Tempting Tango, on the other hand, applies the Confuse status to the target enemy. This can be situationally useful, as Confusion is nice for learning blue magic or just having enemies fight each other, but since there's only a 1 in 4 chance of pulling off the effect, it's not going to come up when you want it to. And if you really desire a confusion effect, the Bard gets one for free that is party-wide and more reliable. This means in most situations, the only useful dance is Sword Dance, which is just a powerful attack, roughly 4 times the strength of your regular attack. Although on Dancer, that's still not going to be great. Dancer doesn't have particularly good combat stats. Its strength modifier is only +5, and it can only wield daggers, which do have some nice options. But since daggers can be used by almost every job, you've probably got a stronger attacker who's using your best daggers as opposed to the Dancer. Especially since Swords Dance only has a 1 in 4 success chance. So, over a long enough period of time, you're not really benefiting from that 4 times damage if 3 out of every 4 turns result in a dud. You can boost the odds of getting a Swords Dance up to 50% by equipping either the Rainbow Dress, Red Slippers, or Lamia's Tiara, but even then, your Dancer's turn is going to be spent flipping a coin to determine whether or not they actually do something you care about. And since this is the point in the game where other jobs start getting access to their premier tools, it feels very underwhelming to have Dancers still relying on RNG. It would be like if Ranger was still using animals instead of going into rapid fire. Dancer's other learned ability, Flirt, is also not particularly good. It's a single target ability that attempts to cause the enemy to skip their next turn. And much like Tempting Tango, this is once again outclassed by the Bard already having access to Stop Song, which is party-wide and also free. At least Flirt doesn't rely on any RNG, but it's ineffective against bosses, which would be the main use case for shutting down a single enemy. Because of how underwhelming Flirt and Charm are, I think the only useful thing about the Dancer is its mastery skill, Equip Ribbons. Ribbons are not a standard type of equipment. Instead, they consist of the Knife Maneater, the Headgear Ribbon, the Armor Rainbow Dress, and the accessory Red Slippers. The Rainbow Dress and Red Slippers aren't particularly good, but I think the Maneater and especially Ribbons are noteworthy enough that you might want to master Dancer for them. Maneater is a relatively weak late-game knife, but it deals effective damage to humans and boosts your strength, stamina, agility, and magic by 2 points each. It is also, for some reason, treated like a spear for Dragoon's jump attack. So if you want to do some Dragoon gaming, the Maneater is a potentially viable option. More noteworthy is the Ribbon, which provides immunity to a large number of status conditions. Specifically, instant death, petrification, toad, poison, blindness, old, berserk, and silence. It also boosts all 4 basic stats by 5 apiece. Personally, I think it's in contention for the best piece of headgear in the game. But natively, it can only be used by freelancers and dancers. So if you don't have anything else you'd rather put in the ability slot, Equip Ribbons can potentially be useful just for getting access to the ribbon headgear. That being said, an ability slot is still a pretty big cost. So I don't think this is the same level as something like Ranger or Red Mage, where you master it just to get access to this super powerful ability. Equip Ribbons is nice, but it's not so nice to salvage the Dancer's otherwise abysmal toolkit. And I personally think Dancer is the worst job in Final Fantasy V. With those 2 stinkers out of the way, we can now talk about the good Earth Crystal jobs. And I want to start out with Samurai, because it's a pretty good contrast to Dragoon, showing why I feel so underwhelmed by the Spear job. Just at a base level, Samurai does good combat, as it has decent physical stats, and its unique weapon type, katanas, are generally good. Not only are katanas on par with or stronger than most other weapons from a statistical standpoint, but they're also all capable of landing critical hits, which, as I mentioned with fists, is not a guarantee on all other weapons. Most katana have a 12% crit chance, although there's a few with even higher critical hit rates. So it's not an uncommon occurrence for your samurai to swing in and deal twice as much damage as usual. The only downside that katana have is, for some reason, they're not compatible with Spellblade. Which is weird because Spellblade usually can affect all other bladed weapons. I suspect the reason for Katana's disclusion was the fact they have a critical hit rate, as it's possible the extra damage from a critical hit and the extra damage from a Spellblade effectiveness would interact in weird and unintended ways. But regardless of the reason, not being able to be enchanted does suck, but it is more than made up for by Katana's everything else being great. The neat thing about Samurai is that in addition to being just a very good generic attacker, they have a pretty deep toolkit you can choose from. Unfortunately, unlike spellcasters, they can only equip one of these abilities at a time, but learning so many powers from leveling up Samurai means the job feels quite flexible, and it can adjust to a variety of different situations. The flashiest of Samurai's abilities is its innate one, Zenniage, where you throw money at the enemy in order to deal damage to them. The damage dealt and money spent are both fixed and depend upon your character's level. And if you're not careful, Zenniage can drain your coffers pretty quickly, as it is almost always going to cost you more money than you make up by killing the enemies. But with fixed damage and huge numbers, Zenniage is probably the most efficient way of killing foes. So, in the late game, when you care much more about your EXP and ABP than you do about your gil, or against bosses where you just want to deal huge chunks of damage, This can be a useful way of converting your excess finances into excess damage. Definitely a good exchange. Of course, if you want to deal damage to a ton of enemies without spending your gil, you can also use Samurai's Ianiuki, which attempts to inflict instant death on all enemies. There's a charge-up time, sure, and it won't work against heavy bosses or anyone with death immunity, but it's still a nice way of clearing screens and can help you grind up if you don't have all the money in the world to throw away. It's also just a good alternative to running away when going through dungeons, as some encounters can't be run from but can be killed. Although it's worth noting, since Ianiuki has a charge time, you're probably going to take a hit or two while relying on it if it's your only way of killing people. Samurai's last activated ability is Mineuchi, which is a normal attack that has a chance to inflict paralysis. And as such, much like aim, this functions as just an upgrade to the standard attack if you have it equipped. Although it's worth noting that unlike standard attacks, Mineuchi will not cure someone of confusion or sleep. Therefore, this ability works pretty well in tandem with a Black Major Bard, as you can inflict debilitating statuses on your foes and then wail away without risk of curing those statuses. Similarly, if you have a Beastmaster controlling the foe, Mineuchi will not break their control. I think this is probably the weakest of Samurai's abilities, but it still has some niche applications where it can be useful. Lastly, Samurai does get one passive ability that is both innate and learned, and that is Shirahadori. With Shirahadori equipped, you have a 25% chance to block enemy physical attacks, similar to if you had a shield equipped. And this is a pretty huge defensive glow-up. Shields are a very powerful piece of equipment, but not every job can or even wants to equip them, as dual wielding or having bows can sometimes be preferable. The fact that Samurai can get the shield benefit without needing to devote one of their hand slots to it is not to be understated. And I would argue anytime you have a build that isn't using shields, it's worth considering this for your ability slot. It's that strong. Lastly, Chemist is another utility job. Its stats are pretty bad, but it still manages to be useful thanks to its passive ability Pharmacology, which doubles the potency of potions and ethers. This might not seem like much on the surface, but changing a high potion from being 500 HP to 1000 is actually kind of huge in the late game when your HP values hover around the 1000 to 1500 mark. And of course, taking Ether's 40 MP to 80 is also a very big deal for mages. It means they have to heal up less often. Chemist's innate activated ability, Drink, is also pretty useful. You see, there are 5 consumable items that can't actually be used in the items menu. Those being Goliath Tonic, Power Drink, Speed Shake, Iron Draft, and Hero Cocktail. And each of these give beneficial effects to the user when consumed. Goliath Tonic doubles your max HP, although it doesn't actually heal you, so you're going to need to devote a turn to healing up if you want. Power Drink increases your attack. Speed Shake gives you the Haste status. Iron Draft gives you the Protect status. And Hero Cocktail raises your level by 10, thusly impacting any calculations that take your level into account. And these are all useful effects. The Speed Shake in particular is useful on the Chemist, as it lets it do its healing job much more often, but any of them are helpful if you give Drink to an actual combat class. Which is why it feels weird that Drink is the innate ability of the Chemist, as opposed to any of its other wonderful activated abilities. You see, it also gets Revive, which lets it heal a KO'd party member similar to Phoenix Down, although with less HP, and Recover, which is a free heal from Blind, Mini, Toad, Silence, Confusion, Paralysis, Old, and Sleep. These are, of course, similar to Isuna and Raise from the White Magic tree, but since they don't cost any MP, the trade-off is a lack of flexibility for more freedom in casting. However, if you are looking for that flexibility, nothing quite encapsulates it like Chemist's final activated ability, Mix, which allows you to combine 2 items for beneficial effects. I could be here all day talking about the various combinations that Mix has, cause it goes pretty deep, but instead I'll highlight a few of my favorites. Combining a Phoenix down with a potion or ether will fully heal the revived ally instead of just getting them to critical HP. Combining a Phoenix down with a turtle shell removes a ton of detrimental status effects, including stuff like petrification or old, which are otherwise pretty difficult to remove. Combining 2 turtle shells gives you the equivalent to the protect and shell spells, meaning it is a more efficient way to protect from mixed attackers than anything White Mage has, and combining turtle shell with holy water gives the berserk status to the target, which again means that Mix can somewhat serve as a pseudo White Mage replacement, instead of spending MP, spending inventory items. Heck, it can also replace the Time Mage, because by combining the turtle shell with eye drops, you can cast haste on someone. And Mix has utility beyond that, because you can also apply elemental absorption to targets, something that is otherwise limited to equipment slots, and very expensive ones at that. Or you can combine the Maiden's Kiss with a Dragon Fang to make someone into the heavy type, granting them the sorts of immunities bosses get for free. You can boost an ally's level, or bring their HP to the max of 9999, and you can even use Mix offensively, trying to inflict statuses, or have a Mix that replicates the effects of Deathclaw. The main limitation of Mix is, of course, you need to have the items to perform it, and since all these items are consumable and not all of them are purchasable, some amount of grinding and farming is required if you want to make use of Mix long term. Although you do get some number of Dragon Fangs for free, and it's pretty easy to farm them in an upcoming area. The other limitation of Mix is the game never really explains the depth of the combinations. Some of them are very straightforward. I figured out Potion plus Phoenix down myself because it just seemed like a natural fit. But others are kind of nonsensical. A turtle shell plus antidote divides the target's defense in half, which doesn't seem like the sort of thing that combination would do. As such, this is the sort of ability that's at its best if you have an external resource such as a wiki open in another window. Although, I would argue even without knowing all of the possibilities, Mix is still incredibly useful if you just stick to the 4 or 5 that you like situationally. Personally, in my 3 playthroughs, I never went into the offensive branches of Mix and instead just used Chemix as a go-to healer, and it proved itself to be incredibly useful. Full revives, status curing, and doubling up on potion heals were more than enough to elevate this job to a spot on my team. But we should probably talk about the Mime class, as it's the last one you'll get in most versions of Final Fantasy V. It serves as a kind of alternative to the Freelancer class, since it also gains the bonuses that Freelancer does upon job mastery. However, unlike Freelancer, it doesn't have access to every single weapon type. Instead, it's limited to knives, staves, and rods, making it somewhat of a magical alternative to Freelancer. In fact, going physical as a Mime is pretty counterintuitive because they don't inherently have access to the attack command, although you can assign it in one of the 3 potential command slots. That's right, Mime has more slots than Freelancer does, since one of them takes over attack, one of them takes over items, and one of them takes over the empty slot. As for Mime's innate ability, it is Mimic, and this will copy the last action a team member did. However, the action's cost is waived away, with the exception of Xenniage, where you still spend the money. This means, with proper timing, you can have a Mime do some ridiculous stuff, such as mimicking dual cast Bahamut for no MP, or spending really expensive items with a Chemist twice for double the effect. You're really only limited by your imagination. Well, and by the ATB system, because it can be kind of tricky to ensure that your mime is copying the exact action you want. Thus, mime is probably the most skill-intensive of the classes in Final Fantasy V. But I also think it's quite powerful, and personally, I would say it is the better alternative to Freelancer. Sure, you don't get the physical weapons or the ability to launch strong attacks, but you can just mimic whatever you want and launch strong abilities for free. Piloted by a competent player, the mime can absolutely trivialize the late game of Final Fantasy V. Which is why, personally, I would rank it in the A tier on a tier list context. Sure, it's not around for the majority of the game, but it is the de facto endgame class for at least half of your party, I would imagine. Once you collect all 12 of the legendary weapons, in the Game Boy Advance version, you get access to 3 new jobs: Gladiator, Cannoneer, and Oracle. But not Necromancer, which is actually locked to the post-game. However, I'm not covering the post-game Super Dungeon because I kind of don't have interest in Super Dungeons, so I'll talk about all 4 of these loser-ass classes here. And they are all pretty awful. Not only because they join at the time you should have your endgame builds online and demand investment in the form of ADP, but also because even if you got these jobs earlier, they would compare pretty poorly to the mainstay jobs from the original SNES version. But they are at least all offering something kind of unique. The first one I want to talk about is Gladiator, as it presents itself as a sort of ultimate physical job, since it can use most weapon types, very similar to Freelancer. Most notably, it is able to access Knight Swords, which otherwise are exclusive to Knights and Freelancers. Not only that, but it has the highest strength modifier in the game, meaning that Monk is now outclassed in the Game Boy version. However, the abilities it offers are not particularly great. Lure just gets more encounters, which is not necessarily the thing that you want at the end of the game. Your grinding sessions should be over by the time you unlock Gladiator. Its other passive, Long Reach, is also kind of interesting. It means that its weapons ignore row restrictions, but that's an innate quality of bows, which Gladiator can already use. So it feels kind of redundant, although it does at least let you use better weapons than bows, because bows kinda suck. So the real redundant thing is, why does Gladiator have bow access? Like, what's the point of that? Its activated abilities are also kind of interesting. Finisher gives you a % chance at landing a powerful 999 damage strike, but it also has a fail case of just wasting your turn. Or it can land a critical hit, which is kind of the halfway point between these two extremes. Blade Blitz, on the other hand, is an AoE attack at about 3/4 of your damage. Very similar to Kick from the Monk, but this one is actually inheritable, so that's nice, I guess. Overall, though, I think this job just offers too little too late. You're at the point in the game where physical jobs are not really at a premium anymore. Of course, the magically oriented GBA job, Oracle, is also not very good. Although it's not because mages aren't good, instead it's because this mage is designed in a nonsensical manner. Its 2 main abilities, Condemn and Foretell, have a variety of effects, but they are determined based upon the last digit of your MP and HP values. Although, I'll be honest, I'm still not sure I fully understand it, despite having read the wiki page multiple times. It's kind of just confusing, but even if you can power through the confusion, the effects are just generally not worthwhile in the endgame. They tend to be outclassed by much simpler abilities on other jobs. And the 2 passives that Oracle offers also kind of feel like a joke. ABP Up is a little bit silly when you've probably mastered every job you care about by this point in the campaign. At least Read Ahead lets you avoid enemy encounters, which can be useful going into the final dungeon, although I'm not sure it's generally worth grinding up Oracle just to get that convenience. Cannoneer has similar problems to Oracle, in that it's a job you generally want to have the wiki open for, since the main appeal of it is its final ability, Combine, which is an alternative to Mix, exclusively using damaging attacks. Unfortunately, because all of the mixes are targeting enemies, it means Combine has a lot less flexibility than Mix from the Chemist. And Cannoneer's other abilities, Open Fire, where you shoot one enemy, and EXP Up, which boosts your experience, are similarly undesirable. I genuinely do not understand why they put the grinding abilities on the last jobs you get. Do people usually save grinding for right before the final boss? It feels counterintuitive in my mind. Lastly is Necromancer, which is a kind of cool in concept alternative to the Blue Mage, as the Necromancer gains access to its dark arts abilities by slaying specific foes, instead of being hit by their attacks. It's kind of cool, and in theory could have been a nice job if it weren't locked to the post-game. But it also has a problem in that the Necromancer needs to be the one to land the finishing blow. So, much like with Beastmaster, it can be kind of finicky to get access to these specific dark arts. That being said, there is another very significant downside holding the Necromancer back, and that is the fact it is permanently undead, which, as you may remember, was a bad enough status condition to be a curse from the Bone Mail. And I would personally argue that the dark arts are not strong enough to overcome this downside. Nor is Necromancer's other ability, Oath, which simply summons one of 4 random enemies and uses their release command. Overall, it feels like kind of missed potential for Necromancer to be locked to the post-game, but it's kind of the story with all of the advanced jobs. Even though the other 3 aren't locked to the post-game, them showing up so late where all you have to do is grind or go to the final dungeon makes them all feel like the big missed potential jobs. I would have found it cooler if instead one of each of these jobs showed up at each of the 4 crystals. They would still almost certainly be very bad at that point in the campaign, but it would at least give you a chance to play with the new toys during the actual campaign of Final Fantasy V, instead of just having them thrown at you towards the end game.